Hello there and welcome back to the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. In this edition, I'm interviewing Ed Saunders, who is the other half of the new team, and we're going to be talking about the new COVID-19 restrictions, the possibility of a second, maybe even a third wave of the virus, and what he thinks of political policing as evidenced at this Saturday's Trafalgar Square protests. The first topic of conversation this week is on the COVID-19 restrictions. Very important quote from the Mirror here that I thought I might read out to you. The guidance says ceremonies and receptions with 15 guests must take place in COVID-secure venues. They are banned from happening in a private house or garden where only up to 6 people are permitted to gather under Rule of 6 laws. The 15-person limit includes the couple, witnesses and guests, but people working, such as a priest or a celebrant, are not included. And the question is, in view of Prime Minister Boris Johnson announcing new restrictions last week that place stringent limits on such events as weddings, funerals, christenings, and a 10 p.m. curfew for pubs and restaurants already struggling, is the government's interventionist and near totalitarian and totally inconsistent cure now becoming a more serious problem than the coronavirus itself?
Firstly, yes. There is a growing, not a consensus, because consensus kind of, well, there's certainly a consensus among the liberty-loving community that the cure is, cure in inverted commas is certainly worse than the impact of the disease. I mean, the thing is, I don't really necessarily see it as a cure versus curse type of thing. At the end of the day, there are many things where, you know, there may be a very effective cure for it. It just happens that if that cure relies on complete government tyranny, I don't care how bad it is. I don't want the cure. You know, if people wish to go and socially distance and self-isolate and this, that, and the other off their own back, and, you know, there's a voluntary organisation, you know, if the track and trace, well, it's voluntary to download it, but not following then the advice is finable if you're told to. If that was all completely voluntary, I'd be absolutely fine with it. It's when it's done by fiat and people are just told because it is. You know, it's like when you get put on the naughty step when you're a toddler. It's just because it is. They seem to now be dropping the pretense that people must follow the rules because because not doing so is going to cause a massive health disaster. They're just saying now quite openly, you must follow the rules, otherwise there'll be a second lockdown. It's just threatening. It's hostage taking. It's threatening. It's no longer about public health. It's
do as I say, not as I do type mentality, isn't it, really?
Well, the Parliament's bar is the first thing. I mean...
Oh, yeah.
Anyway... The thing is, I mean, especially with the pubs and restaurants, if you have a very lively, active place, you know, the middle of a big city, the impact is disproportionately on struggling businesses. Because in the hospitality sector, even if it only temporarily closes the gap in the market, in the middle of London, once all the restrictions have gone, new venues will open up again. Now, if you're looking at like a little pub in the middle of the countryside that serves as the community centre for a given, you know, a village or whatever, which they quite often do. Once that closes, it's not like and it gets turned into a house or something. There's no going back from that. No one just opens up a new village pub in a village of 400 people. Just doesn't happen. So once you've lost it, it's gone. You know, some of these have been open for 500 years. It's a national heritage. Quite frankly, they don't care. They know. They just don't care. They really don't care. It's part of their kind of overall mentality of, if it doesn't affect me, I'm not too worried.
Well, what with this 10 p.m. curfew, it just doesn't make any sense, because if all the pubs are shutting at the same time, more people are going to be coming into contact with one another. And that was precisely the reasoning behind the Licensing Act 2003, which actually enabled pubs to stagger their closing times in order that fights don't break out and people don't really come into contact with one another. It just seems completely the antithesis of what the government is trying to achieve here.
I mean, my local has a license previously, before all of this started, had a license until midnight. You know, they wouldn't always open until midnight, but if there are people in, they would open. You know, there were a few late night drinkers, you know, some of the old boys, and they would come out between, you know, sometimes after 10 p.m. What's happening now, because people know they have a limited drinking time. I mean, I would be down there. That's certainly where I gain a lot of my work from in terms of contracts. You know, they do serve as real community centres, pubs in this country, especially in the countryside. And the thing is, what's happened was, I was down there last night. It's 9:15, I think, or 9:30 last orders for they have to be closed at 10 o'clock, not 10 o'clock last orders. And all that happens is it's just a 9:30 swill. And you have everyone goes in there between the hours of 5 and 10. And then afterwards, everyone goes and goes around someone else's house. It's a complete nonsense. The only person that loses out is the small business owner. It's not the thinking man's way to do it, to put it that way.
And it's certainly not following the science.
That's optional when writing guidance in the case of our government at the moment.
So the next question contains a preamble. Recently, there was ONS figures released for the death statistics. And this is a direct quote from the ONS. The leading cause of death in August 2020 was dementia and Alzheimer's disease in England, accounting for 10.9% of all deaths, and ischemic heart disease in Wales, which was 11% of all deaths. Both leading causes of death were recorded the same in July 2020. The coronavirus, COVID-19, did not feature in the top 10 leading causes of death in August 2020. In England or Wales. In England, COVID-19 was the 24th most common cause of death, and in Wales, it was the 19th most common cause of death for deaths registered in August 2020. And since those latest ONS figures suggest that the pandemic is a significantly lesser issue than it's made out to be, are the new restrictions and government's position justifiable considering such a low rate of death from COVID-19 and the enormity of so many other illnesses either being forgotten about or deliberately ignored by mainstream media?
I mean, it's not just the mainstream media there, Chris. I mean, it is the medical establishment as well. The government has essentially a complete monopoly, not quite complete, but essentially a complete monopoly on healthcare. And therefore, it is very, very much in the interest of the medical establishment to toe the government's line. If it had not been a politicized disease, in many, many cases, there are reports coming out now that if it were anything else, it would have been maybe listed as a comorbidity, reason why, maybe a contributing factor towards the death of a patient. Whereas quite often there has been pressure to just register it as the cause of death. Firstly, it's you're chucking the Hippocratic Oath out of the window, but then again, the pile in terms of things being chucked out of the window, it's starting to pile up beneath it. And then, and again, as you mentioned, it's the mainstream media. I mean, the thing is, in the United Kingdom, we do not have press freedom. Well, there's Ofcom, which is the broadcasting regulator. There's also, and they're not like the FCC in the United States. They don't just control frequency so that people aren't broadcasting over each other's channels. Basically, if you don't toe the line, I mean, Russia Today, it's a state-run media channel by Russia, but it has a RT UK, which is an English speak. Ofcom's looking at revoking their broadcasting license because they don't really toe the line. And I mean, it is biased towards Russia, but at the same time, if you want to have any sort of illusion of press freedom, then having this system is ridiculous. So you've got the mainstream media in combination with the government. The government want to be more authoritarian. The way to do that is to have a crisis, and the media are quite happy to exaggerate any given crisis in order to justify the government then putting in place more authoritarian rules. I mean, let's have a look. In 1997, the Snowdrop campaign. It was never a big issue in the UK until all of the press started making it a thing, fearing that if we didn't enact the firearms legislation, then we'd all be shot as soon as walk out our front door in the morning. It's a very intricate kind of interplay between the media and the government. But in this case, the medical establishment have been complicit in it. Do
you think that the blame ought to be shared between the two, ultimately?
It is the nature of government that does not have a restriction put on it in an unmovable constitutional restriction on its power to always become more authoritarian. The reason the US is doing, it's not a libertarian paradise, but it's certainly better than pretty well anywhere else, is because they have constitutional limits on what the government can do. And in this country, we do not. We have a sovereign parliament, which essentially means that the individual who commands the majority in parliament, in terms of being the prime minister, is essentially an elected absolute monarch. I don't know. It's a difficult one. I don't think you can really ascribe blame to any particular institution. It's cultural. It's really cultural, and it's constitutional. It's the way this country is set up to run in terms of its government.
Right. So now we're moving on to the possibility of a second wave and maybe even a third wave. The question is, since Professor Mark Woolhouse, an epidemiologist within the government's own SAGE advisory committee, has raised the spectre of a third wave of the coronavirus, yet has spoken out against official policy to say that the lockdown doesn't solve the problem, it defers it, and admitted that the government generated no alternative models other than a lockdown scenario in March. Can people really trust the state is doing the right thing? And is this more evidence of policymakers panicking rather than following the science?
I mean, you should never trust that the state is doing the right thing, no matter what they're doing and in what scenario. Most likely they're not, or they're being reckless as to not. But that's just a side note. A wave is created by a lockdown at the end of the day. To be fair, the scientific evidence does say that stopping people from leaving their homes will affect disease transmission in such a way as to, especially a disease that goes in the same way as the coronavirus, in terms of transmission, it will kind of slow the rate at which it propagates throughout society. The thing is, you cannot lock down forever. I don't want to give them any ideas, but you cannot lock down forever. So then every time you unlock down, it's just going to go back up again. It's like saying we've got 50 gallons of water we need to drain from a bucket. The solution is I'm going to sit here with my finger in the hole forever. You eventually need to go up, get up for a toilet break, and when you come down, it's going to happen. So these complete lockdowns that they're doing are just ridiculous. It's just the typical knee-jerk reaction to what happens when you have a government with no constitutional limits on power whatsoever. It's inevitable.
Is it therefore not surprising that they've attempted to shield themselves from any criticism by essentially monopolising the media?
They have, certainly in terms of mainstream media, broadcast channels, there is a large percentage of the population, the kind of baby boomer generation, who they do treat the BBC as the verbatim source of information. That's changing slowly, but through tightening controls on the press, in terms of independent press regulators and things. If a press regulator is independent, then you don't need a regulator because it will regulate itself. The media is not something which or should be regulated. See, the thing is about Britain, we've always been a country that does things, whether it may be diplomacy or whatever. We don't say it outright. It's just a bit of a nudge and a wink. It's very, very possible, someone at BBC or Sky or whatever, it filters down from through the chain of command from the top. And it's kind of if you don't comply with this, we're not saying anything, but, you may not be offered that promotion or whatever happens to be. There is a culture in all of these organizations of compliance, because that's just how we are as a nation. I mean, it is endemic in our culture. Essentially, we've had 1,000 years of continuous governance. We are bound to be a conformist culture.
Sorry, I've got a quote here. This will be from The Standard, and it's from Professor Mark Woolhouse. It says, quote, "There isn't a proven scientific basis for any of this. When we introduced lockdown in the first instance, that was an unproven intervention. By the time we introduced it in the UK on March the 23rd, only one city in the world had demonstrated that it's possible to turn this epidemic around using lockdown," end of quote. I mean, that by any measure is a startling admission, and especially coming from one of the SAGE advisors. So does that admission reinforce the need for people to listen to virologists and epidemiologists who are experts in their field, rather than the politicians who can't get their story straight from week to week? And what may be done differently in a future crisis?
It's certainly a startling admission when the efficacy of a policy decides whether or not to effectively put 65 million people under house arrest. Certainly you'd think that you would want to be entirely sure that what you were doing was absolutely 100% effective before you put in place a policy such as that. And I've heard the argument, the precautionary principle. Now, the thing is, the government does not just have a mandate to look after or to stop the coronavirus being transmitted. What they think they're supposed to be doing, certainly in terms of conventional political wisdom in the West, is looking after society as a whole. So if you're looking out for the interests of society as a whole, basically sticking us back to 2010, if not worse, maybe back to the 30s in terms of our economy. In terms of the precautionary principle, you've got to weigh these things up against each other. I mean, look, how do I put it? If you castrated every male in the country, you would then completely get rid of unwanted pregnancies and abandoned children. Is it a proportional step to take? Maybe not. I think in a future crisis, it would be definitely advantageous maybe for them just to think a little before they do something. And on a last note, the one city that they use lockdown to turn around an epidemic, pandemic. When you're looking to communist China as a model that we've got to follow in how they treat their citizens, then I think there's something very, very wrong with the government that is doing that.
Do you think that people are going to be quicker to criticise anything that they see as near totalitarian, whether it be in a future crisis or whether it be in specific policies, even in more regular times?
I think it's one of these 2 steps forward, 1 step back. As I mentioned earlier, when not bridled by constitutional or practical restraints, the government will tend to creep towards authoritarianism. When that happens, they will give you back some of your freedoms, but they won't give you back as many. You have a crisis, they take all of your freedoms to solve the crisis ends, they give you back your freedoms. They never give you back as many as they took in the first place, and then we just kind of end up doing and all of a sudden, even though they've given back some of our freedoms after the end of any given crisis, they've never given them back, all of them back. So it is creeping totalitarianism.
All the more reason for a written constitution.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I'm just scared these days what they'd write in it.
Yeah, that's another issue. Okay, on to the final topic of today, which is on political policing. And there's been a video that shows a middle-aged woman being thrown to the ground by police officers. So since Mayor of London Sadiq Khan tweeted that the lockdown protest was unacceptable due to safety concerns and that protesters would feel, quote, the full force of the law, end of quote, despite not batting an eyelid at the Black Lives Matter march that took place in June, when participants similarly failed to adhere to social distancing guidelines. Are we living in times of biased political policing?
I think we always have, but I think it's now becoming more apparent. I mean, in terms of BLM versus the COVID thing, in terms of what Sadiq Khan says, obviously, firstly, he is a socialist. But the thing is, at the end of the day, the Black Lives Matter protesters in the UK, when they are protesting, they are just seen as merely breaking the COVID guidelines, but for a good cause, is what the mainstream media sees and the establishment sees it as. With the anti-lockdown protesters, not only are they breaking the COVID guidance in terms of people congregating, but they are also actively, in the eyes of the mainstream media, actively working against this good and healthful thing that we're all trying to achieve, which is, social distancing and the like. It's seen really as, one side's just being a little bit naughty and the other side are doing it with real malice in their heart. They do see it from that kind of puritanical way. The NHS, it's always been our national religion, but we're protecting the NHS by social distancing and things like that. The NHS is the godhead of the religion, and the COVID guidelines are the 10 commandments. So it really is seen from this kind of new puritanical fashion.
So considering the appalling behaviour of state officials and the police during these times, as seen by the videos of officers at the lockdown protest at Trafalgar Square, how worried should we be as and when things return to normal that people with such poisonous and anti-human mentalities are still living and working among us? And what can we do as individuals to affect some sort of change for the better in this respect?
As individuals, we can speak out for liberty-loving causes and explain to people why it is necessary that they have a greater level of individual freedom than they do now, and that we've got an awful lot of work to do. In terms of the people living among us, in East Germany, 1 in every 50 people was an informant for the Stasi. That means they had a handler, and quite a lot of them were financially compensated for their work. 1 in 6 people in East Germany was an occasional informant. They did their little bit for the state, being good citizens and informing upon their friends and neighbours. That's 1 in 6 people happy to comply. The thing is, at the end of the day, the government is already asking people to snitch on their neighbours. There are, I'm guessing, a lot more than 1 in 6 people who are happy to do that. In a surveillance society such as ours, it doesn't take a great many people to be complicit with the actions of the state to cause real damage in terms of individual liberty.
And of course, obviously, our neighbours are still going to be our neighbours after this as well. So we're going to have to live with each other regardless. Maybe it's going to sort of bite people on the backside when this is over and people are realising that my neighbour's an absolute idiot.
But the thing is that people don't do it with malice. They're not doing it for malicious reasons. They do it because they have hook, line and sinker swallowed the propaganda that is being spouted by the mainstream media, and they genuinely believe that they are doing a good thing. They are not acting in bad faith. They genuinely believe that they're doing a good thing, not only for themselves, not only for society, but also in quite many circumstances, a good thing for the person upon whom they're informing, because they believe that they're helping them to become better citizens. It's kind of sick.
And that's when collectivism really turns us over the edge.
It is. And whether it's Tory collectivism or whether it's communism, it's a different branch off the same horrible, ugly tree.
So, final question is, as we now have several local lockdowns affecting more than 17 million people, which is about a quarter of the population of Britain, and rising numbers at pro-liberty rallies, do you believe that lockdown fatigue will spur more people to question what it is they're being asked to do by the state?
I mean, I think there's a certain segment of the population who don't like being told what to do generally. I think that lockdown fatigue will not increase this proportion of the population, because there are some people who they are sheep. They prefer to take commands and live in an ordered structure rather than to have responsibility burdened upon them, and then also to have the freedom to make their own choices about how they wish to live their lives. What lockdown fatigue, as it is being termed, will do is the people that are of the latter category that wish to be able to make their own decisions as to how they wish to live, it will awaken them. So all we have to hope is that there are enough people in that latter category who become kind of awakened and really peed off with what the government are doing in order to effect real change.
Yeah. So there is reason to be hopeful.
There's always reason to be hopeful.
All right. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining me.
Indeed. Likewise. I'll see you soon. Thank you ever so much.
All right, and now we're handing over to Jason, who's going to be talking about the scientific debate and media censorship of using hydroxychloroquine to treat the coronavirus.
One thing I think that has been lacking throughout the coronavirus pandemic has been any talk or much discussion on therapeutics and ways of treating the virus. Now, the biggest one I've come across, and I'm sure many of you have heard of it and some of you haven't, is hydroxychloroquine. Now, this was first touted by Donald Trump months ago. He came out to say that he was using it. He was on it at the time, at the press conference. And immediately after that, everything seemed to kind of shut down around the discussion or the debate or the efficacy of this very cheap, commonly used anti-malarial drug. And I just want to be clear, I'm not in any way advocating for people to run out and go and get themselves some hydroxychloroquine and start taking it. Remembering that, any medication that you're thinking about taking needs to be prescribed by your doctor, and your GP should be consulted before taking any sort of medication. I mean, that goes without saying. First time I think most people had ever heard of hydroxychloroquine was, as I said before, it was at a press conference, and Donald Trump was asked whether he was taking it or not, and he answered yes. And he said he had had letters from doctors to say that they had already been using it as a treatment, and that Donald Trump knew that there were a lot of frontline doctors that were already taking it as a preventative measure, being that they're treating COVID patients. And it just seemed like there were people already using it. It hadn't done any harm to anyone. It seemed to be working. Your claims of doctors, had 300 patients that were being treated, and they hadn't had a single death. As the story unravels till present, there seems to be an overwhelming anecdotal evidence from frontline doctors in ERs, in hospitals, in doctor surgeries that have had unbelievable success. The fact that Donald Trump was the one to bring it up, the whole matter became completely politicized. And you had the left-wing media desperate to shut the whole thing down. There's no way they could have Trump coming out with the wonder cure. And I think from then on, there was a campaign to completely suppress all the information in regards to this, and became another ghastly example of how politicized our science has become. And the whole way through this pandemic, really, there's been so much talk of the science. And that is really all we've had to rely on. We've got different groups from different universities, from different organizations around the world, all doing tests, experiments, studies on various aspects of this disease. The results of these studies are basically what governments around the world have been basing their policies on. So going back to hydroxychloroquine, in the weeks and months following the press conference, there'd been a number of studies testing the theory. Does hydroxychloroquine work in the treatment of coronavirus? And one of the big ones, I think, that really had the biggest impact on the use of this was a large observational study of over 15,000 patients. I'm going to read out an article that was published on the 22nd of September, written by Melissa Davey, published in The Guardian Online, to get all the facts over to you. So this is quoting from the article. One of the world's leading medical journals, The Lancet, has reformed its editorial policies following a shocking case of apparent research misconduct involving the study of hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID-19. In May, The Lancet published a peer-reviewed study about the controversial drug hydroxychloroquine, which concluded COVID-19 patients who received the drug were dying at higher rates and experiencing more heart-related complications than other virus patients. The large observational study analyzed data purported to be from nearly 15,000 patients with COVID-19 who received the drug alone or in combination with antibiotics, comparing this data with 81,000 controls who did not receive the drug. This data was recorded by hospitals around the world in a database by a US data analytics company known as Surgisphere. The Lancet paper said, the findings prompted the World Health Organization to halt its own clinical trials of the drug, given the paper's findings that it was linked to deaths and complications. But days after the paper was published, Guardian Australia revealed issues with the Australian data in the study. Figures on the number of COVID-19 deaths and patients in hospitals cited by the authors did not match up with the official government and health department data. Senior clinicians involved in the COVID-19 research told Guardian Australia they had never heard of Surgisphere database. Researchers from other countries identified similar issues with the data from their hospitals, and further Guardian Australia investigation revealed doubts over whether the database used by the study authors even existed. Sepan Desai was a co-author of the paper and founder of the Surgisphere database. Following the revelations, information about Surgisphere was deleted from the internet. It is also revealed that none of the co-authors of the paper had seen the Surgisphere data for themselves, and they said that Desai did not give them access to it even after questions about the paper were raised by Guardian Australia and the research community. The paper's co-authors, which included a highly respected vascular surgeon, supported the retraction of the paper and distanced themselves from the data. Wow, okay, so essentially what this article is saying is that there's a handful of doctors and some shady data analytics company that published a study saying that hydroxychloroquine is dangerous and it's killing more patients than it's saving, and it comes out in the wash that the whole study was nonsense. The data was incorrect. Some fairly shady goings on with this data analytics company. And, you know, these are the kinds of studies that our governments are essentially basing their policies on. This was published in the Lancet Journal, medical journal, which is, you know, a highly respected journal. And it even led to the WHO themselves stopping their own study into the safety and efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. And from then on, there just seemed to be radio silence on the subject. The whole thing became so toxic that no scientists or researchers really wanted to touch it with a barge pole. Here's another article published in the Mail Online. This is by Connor Boyd. The headline is, Hydroxychloroquine is being discounted too soon, say scientists who believe the malaria drug could save thousands of lives by preventing COVID-19. Here's an excerpt from the article. Hydroxychloroquine could prevent tens of thousands of people dying from coronavirus, but the controversial malaria drug is being discarded prematurely, top scientists have warned. While studies have proven it cannot treat patients who have already caught the virus, experts say it may still be able to stop people from getting infected in the first place. Donald Trump has repeatedly touted the medicine as a game changer without scientific evidence to back up his claims, and has even admitted to taking it himself to prevent COVID-19. British researchers behind one of the largest global trial testing hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis say their work is in jeopardy because it has become too politicized. They have warned dropping the drug will block science from finding out if the medicine can really stop coronavirus from entering the body, potentially saving thousands of lives. And there you have it, you know. It's all just, you know, the whole subject has become so muddied that we quite possibly could have overlooked. And I'm not saying it is going to work. I'm not saying it is the cure-all. I'm not saying it, but there's a lot of doctors out there that are saying that it could be extremely useful and it could save a lot of lives. And the fact that it's become politicized the way it has, and the studies are not being done, you know, we potentially let thousands of people die. And this is not the only therapeutic that is being researched at the moment. There's a lot of good evidence that high doses of vitamin D can really reduce the rates of infection. And these sorts of things are not really being discussed. There's not huge amounts of investment going into these. We've got billions of pounds going into vaccines and to track and trace and all these other things, but things that are really actually going to help people and try and actually save some lives is not getting any airtime. Very little discussion on it. So yeah, that's where we are, people. I guess moral of the story is don't believe everything that you read just because it's a scientific study. Who funded it? It's the whole game is just completely rigged, infested with politics, and yeah, you really got to dig beneath the surface to try and get any sort of truth these days. But thanks for listening. Make up your own minds, do the research, and we'll catch you next time.
And that's everything for this week. Join us next week when my guest will be Dan Lidicott of the recently founded Independent Libertarians Association. Don't forget to follow us on social media and check out our website. And until next week, thanks for listening.